Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this GamersInsider.com video we're going to be discussing the performance of the GTX 1070 Ti. You're going to say to yourself, wait, what? The reviews aren't available yet, right? This is true. Unfortunately, certain AIBs have not gotten the memo that these results should be under embargo, and indeed we have a whole bunch of numbers which pit the GTX 1070 Ti's against the GTX 1080s, and it gives us a very fascinating insight into what we should be expecting for these new cards. Second of all, we're going to have a bit of a bonus, and that is asking and answering a very simple question. What exactly is the purpose of the 1070 Ti? A number of viewers have been asking me this very same question, so I figure we can tackle it in this video. So, let's be starting out, shall we, with, once again, the performance results. We'll start out with the less interesting set, and those are from Asus. And these originally appeared on OC3D. Now, what this does do is give us some insight that, yes, the 1070 Ti ROG Strix model, if it's being overclocked, and we've discussed that previously, that it needs to be a manual overclock, puts almost a 4% difference in Doom, or about a 2% difference in Gears of War 4 Ultra. So, in reality, you're looking at just 43.4 frames per second on Gears of War in Ultra, which in turn is a couple of points lower than what a GTX 1080 would be capable of. Similarly, we have 9153 and 8985, that is for the ROG Strix and the reference GTX 1070 Ti's, respectively, in 3D Mark Firestrike. While those results are a nice, okay, that gives us some insight, perhaps the most telling is the results from Galax and Gainwood, and these results paint a very interesting picture indeed. So first of all, we'll start with the topmost result of 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme. We can see the blue bar represents the GTX 1080, which scores 10,235 points. Now the overclocked 1070 Ti/Ti, which is running almost at 1800 MHz with 1871 on the boost, scores 1 point shy of 10,000. What does this mean? Well, very simple. The 1080 is definitely ahead. And if you're not overclocking it, so you're buying a reference GTX 1070 Ti/Ti, then it's roughly 400 points slower. But it's pretty obvious that the grey bar, once again of course representing the 1070, gets absolutely stomped by the Ti's. And, you know, roughly you're looking at about 1100 points, 1200 points difference. I say 11 to 1200 because obviously custom models and all of that stuff may also be taken into consideration. What about Galax? Well, this is also pretty interesting. The results are very similar. Firestrike Extreme, of course 3D Mark, the 1080s score 10,236, which is a pretty sizable lead. About 700 points over the 1070 Ti, but once again around 1200 points separates the Ti and the 1070s. Lastly is Rise of the Tomb Raider. So starting with Rise of the Tomb Raider, at 2K you're running at 78 frames a second compared to 1080p's 107. Obviously, some of the details are not particularly forthcoming here. It doesn't give us a huge amount of insight into the quality settings, or, at least as far as I can see, whether it's DX12 or DX11 mode. But, for some sake of comparison, you're looking at around 90 frames per second, with most of the details at absolute highest on DirectX 12, that is, of course, running at 1440p, or certainly way over 120-130 frames a second at 1080p. And finally, Battlegrounds at 1080p 94 frames a second, and at 2K 67 frames a second. So, now we've gone through the results, assuming things don't change drastically for final silicon, what do we have for the conclusion? Well, very simple. Despite the fact that it only has 128 fewer CUDA cores than the 1080, there is still definitely quite a gap. What is that? Probably memory bandwidth, let's just be honest. I would not say that these results are conclusive because we don't have enough overclocking information. My personal take on this is that, quite frankly, you're probably going to get much more mileage out of overclocking the GDDR5 memory. Don't forget, however, R5 and R5X do have latency differences. So R5X does have higher latency than R5. So one benefit of a tightly overclocked 1070 Ti is that it might, I won't say will, outperform, but it might at least help to keep up with a 1080. Now the last question that a lot of people are asking, very simple actually, and you can't kind of blame them, given the price point of this card, which is around $430 US, and that, by the way, is for the standard reference. So particularly when you start dealing with these overclock models, which are way north of that, in some cases they're probably going to be out 500 or more US, why would you actually want to buy one of these cards? And more to the point, why have Nvidia made these cards? Well, let's start with the why first. Why would Nvidia make these cards? Very simple. It's probable that, but now that the 1080 and the 1070s have been out for quite some time, the manufacturing process is pretty refined. Therefore, they're in this weird position where there's an awful lot of cores, GP104s, and the actual core, which of course makes up either the 1080 or 1070, which doesn't quite live up to the standards needed for the 1080. In other words, it doesn't quite have all of the CUDA cores enabled, but so it needs 2560, of course, to hit the requirements for the GTX 1080, but also has way north of the 1920, which are required for the 1070. In other words, it's possible there may just be a single unit which is damaged. Therefore, the easiest way to deal with that, or perhaps GPU cores which don't quite hit the clock speeds, or perhaps aren't stable enough for them to feel confident, then they can plonk those into the GTX 1070 Ti's. As for why you would buy them, it's a bit tricky. Really, it comes down to our friend and buddy pricing. Unfortunately, the 1080s have managed to retain their pricing pretty well. Many had hoped that the Vega 56 and 64s would have helped to dislodge that, but the Vega cards are very competitive, but they don't outright beat the 1080 or 1080 Ti or the 1070s. And secondly, memory has been an absolute pain in the arse, and GDDR5 memory is pretty expensive, but R5X is even more expensive. So what you have is this really weird position where the market hasn't really reduced the price of the 1080s enough. So Nvidia are in this kind of weird position where the best thing for them to do is to release a card which essentially apes a lot of the performance of the 1080, but they can use cheaper parts. What I would have liked for them to have done is to put in 9 Gbps memory. The problem, of course, with that, as you can probably imagine, well, it would have cannibalized a lot of their 1080 sales. Now, what does that mean for you? Well, honestly, if you've got the cash, go for the 1080. If you don't have the cash, then obviously the 1070 is probably the better purchase. But if you're in this mid-ground, then either the 1070 Ti or possibly the Vega 56 is the way to go. The only reason that I have any reservations about the Ti is quite simple. The Vega 56 overclocks like an absolute demon. Not only does the core do pretty well, but perhaps more telling of all, the HBM memory gets a lot of extra performance to the GPU when you crank it up. Now you could search Vega 56 on this channel, Vega 56 versus GTX 1080, something like that, or Vega 56 tweaking would also pop up the video. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. And you could see that a tweaked 56, and this is with some older drivers by the way, does quite compellingly take on the 1080. Of course, the problem with the Vega cards is that they're in kind of short supply at the moment, and the pricing has also been, well, like a yo-yo, mostly because of the mining. So, does this mean that the 1070 Ti is a bad card? Does it mean that it's dead? No, of course not. It is a very good card, most likely for the price. The only issue I have is if it's going to be really good for mining. One thing that's telling me it may not be miner's best friend is that the mining software does typically prefer higher bandwidth if memory recalls for Pascal. So it's possible that it may not really give them that much more performance over just a vanilla GTX 1070. However, I say that without A, being anywhere near an expert in mining, and B, without actually having one of these cards to test it with any particular miner. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video and found it somewhat, informative. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.